This is 1 Samuel 15, verses 2 and 3. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. So, now that passage, some people call it one of the difficult passages of the Bible, because it does seem like the Lord is commanding ethnic cleansing, slaughtering infants. And moreover, you might wonder, why slaughter the animals? I mean, what did they do to deserve to be slaughtered along with the Amalekites? Even if it's true that the Amalekites have done something nasty to Israel, why slaughter the babies and the animals?
So how have Christian philosophers dealt with this passage?
Well, Bill Craig, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I absolutely admire the work of William Lane Craig. I mean, I think he's, wasn't he ranked like the first most influential philosopher in human history or something like that? Or is that what Donald Trump said about him? Basically, he says, and I agree, that the Amalekite men and women were totally depraved. I mean, these were like, criminally insane, dangerous, immoral people who become so hardened in their sin that the probability of them repenting, even though they'd had like 400 years to repent, I mean, it's like, that's enough time. I know people say, well, free will, you can't predict anything. Well, maybe they're going to repent tomorrow. We should give more time. But, I mean, we can talk about that another time, like whether that's a real problem. But in any case, God decided it's time for judgment on them, and they deserved it because they're just reprobates. The babies and the kids, well, if you've seen your parents get stabbed to death, it's probably better for you to just go ahead and die too. And if you're haven't reached the age of reprobation, where you're around reprobate, just a baby, you're going straight to heaven. So it's actually an infinite good. So by stabbing those babies, and that's what the Israelite soldiers probably told themselves. They see a baby, it's very hard probably to just stab a baby or cut up a baby. But if you could see it through God's eyes, it's like, hey, I'm doing these babies a favor. I'm doing they're doing them an infinite good. And now some people say, well, maybe that means we should go ahead and start killing babies just as a matter of policy, because it's like a pipeline to heaven. Just stab a baby, straight to heaven. Stab a baby, straight to heaven. And, so maybe that way they don't grow up, and you never know what free will is going to do. So they might grow up and be like, well, I ain't going to believe in Jesus. And so they go to hell, So if you kill them while they're young, it's straight to hell. It's guaranteed salvation. Anyway, that's a problem, I know, so we can talk about that another time. But Clay Jones, he points out, he's another great Christian philosopher, maybe second most influential of all time, who we're hoping, we'll see. Anyway, he says, he points out something that Craig just leaves out, it's about the animals. Now, we know that the Amalekites were engaged in systematic bestiality. I mean, as soon as they get a puppy or whatever, it's like probably a whole initiation ritual using Baal and Moloch and all those weird Dagon or whatever those weird gods they had, kind of H.P. Lovecraft kind of creatures they worshiped, And, so basically all those animals were sexually depraved. You don't want your farm to be filled with hypersexual animals. So you just have to kill them, And that's probably good for the animals too, not to be running around.
Couldn't an omnipotent God sort of cure them of their depravity? The animals? The animals.
Well, I mean, he could, but, if he didn't, and it might seem like, well, that'd be the better thing to do, obviously. With the Amalekite parents, the adults, I mean, God isn't going to interfere with their free will, so he's going to let them do what, it's not going to be, I'm not going to mess with your free will, even if you're harming everybody and hurting your animals and everything. I'm not going to step in, because free will is like apparently super important to God. Unless you Calvinists
free will
don't
of
think
the
it.
animals, maybe.
Well, it's not clear that animals have free will. Now, here's a story about animal sin that I think people have not taken seriously. Like, so maybe, you know how there's Adam and Eve for the people? Maybe there's Adam and Eve for dogs. Maybe there's Adam and Eve for cats, ox. Every species has its own Adam and Eve, and maybe they all fell. Maybe every one of them chose, like there'd be a bunch of like snakes that talk, telling them, don't eat this. It could be like a dog, like, don't eat this kind of dog food or whatever. And they do. And then they fail. And then that way, hey, all the animals deserve what they're getting, So that's an animal theodicy people haven't considered. So I kind of like the idea that animals have free will and they're all like dirty sinners too. They're just choosing. That would make it a lot easier. Animals that have, that didn't like what their human, owners who were dedicated to bestiality would do to them, they're kind of broken animals. I mean, it's an act of mercy to kill them. So actually, what God is commanding here is acts of mercy.
Love, in a way.
It's love. It's divine love, and sometimes divine love doesn't seem like what we would think of as love. It's the same with the doctrine of hell. I mean, people say, hey, how could, like, if you found a human father who, some of his kids, he like gave them everything they wanted. He put up, whatever they needed and wanted. He took care of them. He loved them and so on, fed them, made sure they had everything they need. And like the other half of his kids, or maybe more than half, kept them in like a dungeon down in the basement and chained up and beat them and stuff. Like, it's like heaven and hell. You see what I'm saying? And people might say, yeah, if a human father did that, that's not love. Like, you don't torture things that you love, right? You can't. Well, I mean, we can't apply that to God. The divine love is perfectly compatible with eternal torture. I mean, you may not call it love, but that's just because you don't understand divine love. Like, so God, when he is burning people in hell, that's because he loves them. The real tragedy here is what it must have done to the Israelite soldiers who were going around doing this thing. I mean, it must have been really hard to just stab babies and pregnant women, and killing animals is probably no problem, but that's
What about the puppies?
Well, it doesn't mention the puppies.
It does seem a little bit psychotic to kill all the animals and the children.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, there are a lot of things that commandments of God and also doctrines that like the Trinity and the incarnation and the creation from nothing and so on. They all looks like absurdity. You know what I mean? And you got to remember, like, a couple of attitudes you can have toward this thing. You could say, well, human reason, I'm going to follow my own human reason, and then you're going to conclude, like, this is a bunch of absurd nonsense, and some of it looks downright evil. Or you're going to say, no, God knows better. I need to have epistemic humility. Like, there's a lot of Christian philosophers talking about this. Now, it's an old idea. It goes back to, at least to Leibniz. It probably goes way back. God actually probably goes back to St. Paul, where he says, the wisdom of man is foolishness to God, and Greeks look for wisdom, and Jews look for miracles. But we preach Christ crucified, stumbling block to the Jews, and the foolishness to the Greeks, right? Something like that. So it's like the wisdom of man, we don't understand it looks dumb to us, right? And it's funny because I think a lot of religions have recognized this, Islam and Buddhism and a lot of other religions, where they know that the truth is beyond your comprehension. So, but the thing is, they got the wrong absurd looking things and we got the right ones.